Hey everybody, welcome back to Dreamseed VR. I'm your host Sarah Finn, and today we're going to go ahead and talk about one of my favorite science fictions, Frank Herbert's Dune. Now, as you can see, a lot of the Dune nerds are really excited for the new adaptation that comes out this Thursday and Friday by director Denis Villeneuve. For those of you who are not familiar with this director, he's actually the same guy who did the recent sequel to Blade Runner 2049, and he's also the guy who directed Arrival. He happens to be one of my favorite directors of the past few years. I've been blown away by his work every time. So even though I know with every adaptation there are going to be some liberties taken with the source material, I'm really excited about his interpretation of the first novel. From what I understand, this first film takes care of about half of the first novel. So he's really taking his time. Hopefully the pacing will allow for a lot of richness and depth to the character development as well as the overarching plot. And today I wanted to talk a little bit about one of the key concepts from the series as a whole. I want to talk to you about the spice. And I want to talk to you about some of the interesting overlaps between people's perceptions of a particular psychedelic and the nature of the spice. That psychedelic is DMT. So DMT, otherwise known as dimethyltryptamine, is the only endogenous psychedelic in the human biology. It's actually produced in your brain. There's been a lot of research over the past several years to try to figure out exactly where it's produced. It's been hypothesized that it's produced in the pineal gland, but that has yet to be proven directly. It seems as though it might be produced in the general neighborhood, and then its functionality is really at the forefront within the pineal tissue. DMT has an incredible amount of lore and mythology around it. It's one of the most powerful psychedelics known to humankind, and it's created a lot of culture around it in the past 20 years or so. It became much more popular in the mainstream due to a book called DMT, the Spirit Molecule by Rick Strassman. It's also one of the key ingredients in the brew known as ayahuasca, which is used in South American indigenous traditions as a medicine as well as a spiritual connection to the other realm, the other world, hyperspace, whatever you want to call it. Now, ayahuasca is a little different than just DMT by itself. Ayahuasca has a MAOI, a monoaminoxidase inhibitor component. This allows for it to be metabolized by the human body in a slower way, and it also augments the experience to be more dreamlike and easier to handle the pace of. It's still incredibly powerful, and it's an earth-shaking experience, but those who partake in ayahuasca ceremony are in for a much longer ride, and it has a different tone and feeling to it as opposed to those who smoke DMT on its own. Now, DMT can both be extracted as well as synthesized. It's more often extracted from a variety of different plants, but most often it's going to be Mimosa hostilis. It's interesting because in the ayahuasca brew, it comes from a leafy plant called chacruna, and the MAOI component comes from Banisterius caapi, which is a beautiful spiraling vine that looks a little bit like DNA. Now, the reason I give you this background on DMT initially is because I'm also going to tell you a little bit about the fictional spice. Now, I first noticed in the psychedelic community many, many moons ago that on the forums of a website called tribe.net, which was sort of like the social network for burners back in the, I would say like early 2000s, a lot of people would compare psychedelics in general to the spice Mélange from Dune. I found it particularly interesting when people would compare the spice to DMT. Now, I have definitely had my fair share of DMT experiences, and if I were going to go ahead and pick a singular psychedelic that I feel like has the most affinity with the nature of the spice, I would definitely choose DMT. In Frank Herbert's 1965 novel Dune, how do I say this? Spoiler alert? Yeah, for those of you who haven't read the novel, I highly recommend it. It's a classic for a reason. It's absolutely stunning. The world building is very thorough and thick. Dune is a world that is essentially a desert planet, and it has become the center of a interplanetary conflict because this planet is the location where the spice Mélange exists solely. It's the only place in the known universe where spice exists. Now, spice is a substance that's produced from an early life stage of an indigenous species to the planet called the sandworm. In their earlier life phases, they're called sand trouts, and they have various excretions like living creatures do. And these deposits of excretion become pressurized under the sand. And after enough time, they burst through the sand and rise to the surface, where they then dry out in the hot desert environment and they become what's known as the spice. Now, the spice is used for various reasons throughout the universe. The Spacing Guild utilizes spice to be able to see through space-time, and they do this as a way of facilitating intergalactic space travel. This way they can navigate through asteroid fields, stars, large clusters, nebula, any kind of obstruction that would potentially damage a space freighter type vehicle. They are able to see through the obstacles of space-time utilizing the spice. And this is why spice navigators mutate over time from their heavy doses of the Mélange. Now, because of this, spice is integral to deep space travel. There is no commerce without it. There's no way to facilitate an intergalactic economy without it. Aside the metaphors of the spice as a psychedelic within the psychedelic community, a lot of people have hypothesized that the spice is a metaphor for oil, for crude oil. Now, that's not the subject of this video. You can go ahead and read the book for yourself and decide if that's the case. The spice allows people to not only extend their lifespan, but it allows them to expand their consciousness. And this expansion not only moves through space-time, as I've depicted with the use of it by guild space navigators, but also the Bene Gesserit. Now, the Bene Gesserit are a sect of space witches, for lack of a better word, and they have been doing a breeding program for something like 90 generations or something in an attempt to breed a superhuman. And they use the spice to not only expand their consciousness, but also to access genetic memory. And they do this in a variety of ways. In particular, Reverend Mothers use what we would call the water of life as a means of accessing their genetic memories. Now, the water of life is somewhat similar to the regular spice melange in the sense that it still comes from sandworms, but it comes from an even earlier stage of life. It comes from baby sandworms, and it comes from, this can be graphic. I know it's fictional, but it's still graphic. This comes from drowning a baby sandworm. And in its death throes, right before it dies, it vomits up bile, essentially. And that concentrated fluid is also spice. It's just a super highly concentrated version of spice. And this particular stuff is lethal to anybody who's not trained in the prana bindu body control that the Bene Gesserit specialize in. On the planet Arrakis, there is a sort of rogue sect of Bene Gesserit Reverend Mothers who are Fremen, and they too use the water of life in their ceremonies to pass on the genetic memory from an elder Reverend Mother who is passing away to the new Reverend Mother. It's really interesting to think about the possible overlaps between DMT and the spice. And I say this because so many people's experiences with DMT bring an experience that feels as though they are traveling through hyperdimensional space. And oftentimes they'll have really profound reflective experiences that give them insights into their own memory. Yeah, this idea of getting in touch with one's higher dimensional self, or, getting in touch with one's genetic memories, or one's ancestors. A lot of people feel as though DMT does expand their consciousness and does give them a richness in their lives that they hadn't had access to prior. That it's something that opens up the valleys of time for them to be able to perceive things outside of this 3D space. I'm really excited about the new movie, if you can't tell. I'm like really excited about it. Do you like my Gom Jabbar? I made it out of foil. So there you have it. Pretty quick episode today. I just wanted to talk about the cool overlaps between dimethyltryptamine and the spice. Dune is such a rich and fascinating and really deep world. Frank Herbert is an incredible author. So for those of you who are already fans of Frank Herbert's work, but you want a little bit more, I highly recommend another series of his. It's significantly shorter, but just as good a quality. It's called the Consentiency series, and it starts with a short story called The Tactful Saboteur. And it goes on with a short novella as the second installation called The Whipping Star, and then it finishes off with a full novel called The Dasadi Experiment. Now, it's fairly easy to pick this up at the Dasadi Experiment if you don't want to do the first two installations. It stands well enough on its own. It's an incredible book. It's definitely one of my favorite, in my top 10, without a doubt. It gave me like a baby existential crisis at the end of that one. It's really, really well done. I don't want to give you any spoilers. It's just absolutely mind-blowing. If you want to see what it's about, I recommend just taking a peek on the Wikipedia. But in general, it has a lot of the same themes of Dune, but in a very different way. It's handled completely differently. But it has lots of really interesting relationships between different species that have different biologies, different cultures, life cycles, things like that. And it's handled really well on the part of Frank. It's definitely of the same quality, in my humble opinion, as Dune itself. It was that good. Gosh, I would feel so lucky if they could do a film of that someday. It would be really badass. But yeah, I highly recommend that. That's The Tactful Saboteur, The Whipping Star, and The Dasadi Experiment. So I hope you enjoyed this silly little episode today. I really enjoyed dressing up like this and sipping on some good old water of life with you. Be sure to go check out how cool the new one is if you're a Dune fan. If you're not a Dune fan, it's a classic for a reason. The books are incredible, and there's no shortage of material. The series is very long, and it's all awesome. And if you get to the end of that and you still need more, Frank's son went through all of his papers in the estate and continued on the story. People have mixed reviews of that, but as far as staying true to the source material that his father created, he's very diligent in that regard, and I respect it. Some of my close friends who are fanatical Dune fans, as I am, say great things about it. So I think it's just a matter of personal taste. But the Dune universe awaits you, as does the spice. And thank you for joining me. I get choked up. Like, I love Dune so much, I get choked up. But you can support the channel by checking out my Patreon at patreon.com/Seraphin. You can check out the website dreamseedvr.com, as well as our Instagram, dreamseed_VR. And yeah, I have some really exciting interviews coming up. I have an interview with the mega talented Zane Rogers, who is a 3D VR sculptor who makes incredible masks and ancient artifacts with his virtual reality rig and 3D printing. And I will be reading H.R. Giger's BIOMECHANICS for you sometime soon in Reading Rainbow style for Halloween. And I hope you enjoyed this. I will catch up with you next time. Bye for now.